Tonight, we take a quiet journey back to the island of Singapore, a place that sits at the crossroads of history and fate. Imagine the salt-tinged breeze that wraps around you as you step onto this small island, where a powerful blend of cultures collides. Just a speck on the map, yet its history carries the weight of dreams and challenges that stretched far beyond its shores. Singapore's story is one of ambition, perseverance, and a surprising twist of fate. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world like a family, scattered but still connected. All right. Now, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a soft hum in the background, something that feels like home. Nestle in, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's story together. In the early 19th century, when Singapore was merely a small island off the coast of the Malay Peninsula, it was far from the bustling metropolis it is today. The British saw it as an ideal place to set up a trading post, a port where goods could flow in and out of Southeast Asia like a channel for the tides. Sir Stamford Raffles, the British colonial officer most famously credited with founding Singapore in 1819, didn't exactly envision the future of an independent nation. No, in those early days, it was all about commerce fueled by trade routes and spice not nation building or sovereignty. You're probably wondering why even start with a trading post. Well, because this was the first piece of the puzzle, the foundation upon which the Singapore we know today would rise. Back then, the island wasn't even really a part of any particular kingdom. It was just a port, one of many dotted along the shores of Southeast Asia. Singapore's early days were marked by a constant rotation of foreign powers from the Malays to the Dutch, and finally the British. But it was under British rule that the city began to grow. Historians still argue whether Raffles had a grand plan for Singapore beyond its commercial potential, or if he simply stumbled into a position where he could claim a prize for the British Empire. Perhaps he thought that Singapore was merely another tool in the colonial toolbox, but over time, this little island would become a thorn in the side of its colonial rulers. Fast forward a bit, and the inhabitants of Singapore weren't just interested in commerce anymore, they were interested in governing themselves. The seeds of change had been planted, but the road to self-rule was far from easy. As you settle into the story, let's move on to the next chapter in Singapore's evolution, its quiet but persistent push toward self-government. Imagine a city in the midst of rapid growth, skyscrapers poking through the clouds, a bustling port with ships lining up to unload their goods. But despite its prosperity, the people of Singapore were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with their status as a mere colony. They wanted more, and that yearning for something greater started to stir beneath the surface. The British, however, were not particularly eager to hand over the reins. They viewed Singapore as a key piece in their imperial chessboard, a valuable outpost in Southeast Asia with access to trade routes and military strategies. The British weren't the kind to just give up control without a fight, and so Singapore's journey to self-rule was slow, uncertain, and often riddled with bureaucratic hurdles. Historians still argue whether the British were truly trying to keep Singapore down, or whether they simply couldn't imagine a future where the island wasn't part of the empire. After all, Singapore's geographical position made it an invaluable strategic asset. Who could possibly want to give that up? But in the 1940s, things began to change. World War II had done more than just reshape the globe. It had upended the imperial order. When Japan invaded Singapore in 1942, the British defense was shockingly weak, and the island fell in just a few days. It was a humiliating blow to the British, and perhaps even more humiliating for the people of Singapore, who had come to realize that their fate wasn't entirely in the hands of foreign powers. The fall of Singapore was a turning point as it forced the population to question the legitimacy of British rule. If the British couldn't even defend the island, what kind of power did they truly hold? By the end of the war, the British were weakened both militarily and economically, and this emboldened local leaders in Singapore. In 1945, the British promised reform steps towards self-governance, but the locals were wary. Were these promises genuine, or just a way to placate the masses until the British regained their strength. In 1946, Singapore was officially made a crown colony, which meant that it could have more control over its internal affairs but not complete independence. The struggle for full self-government had only just begun. The people of Singapore, particularly the Chinese and Malay communities, began to organize themselves politically, with the People's Action Party (PAP) emerging as one of the most significant forces. They wanted a fairer, more democratic society. They didn't just want a few crumbs of power, they wanted the whole pie. And so Singapore entered the post-war period with a new sense of determination, setting the stage for its eventual independence. The question now wasn't whether Singapore could be self-governing, but how far it could go in breaking free from colonial shackles. As you ease deeper into the night, let's dive into a pivotal moment in Singapore's story, its internal struggles, and the rising ethnic tensions that added layers of complexity to the road toward independence. Imagine a vibrant city soaked in the sun, full of life, but beneath the bustling streets and colorful markets there's an undercurrent of division. Singapore, like much of Southeast Asia, was a melting pot of various ethnic communities, the Malays, the Chinese, the Indians, and others, and each community had its own vision for what the future of Singapore should look like. These ethnic tensions had been simmering for years, but they were about to boil over. The Chinese, the largest group in Singapore, had long felt marginalized by the British, and many were drawn to communism as a way to push back. The Malays, on the other hand, often saw themselves as the natural leaders of the region, with ties to the larger Malay Federation across the water in Malaya. The Indians, too, had their own aspirations, influenced by the rising tide of Indian nationalism. Historians still argue whether Singapore's ethnic strife was inevitable given its complex demographic makeup, or whether it was merely a result of British colonial policies that had played one group off against another. It's one of those debates where both sides seem to have a compelling argument. After all, the British themselves had often treated Singapore as a fragmented, divided society to keep control. Despite the tension, Singapore had to take its first real steps toward self-rule in the 1950s. The British had promised a self-governing colony, but they were careful about how much power they actually gave away. Singapore's first election in 1955 saw the PAP, led by Lee Kuan Yew, emerge as a powerful political force. Lee and his allies were passionate about a Singapore that was independent, united, and free from colonial influence. They had a vision, but they also had to confront the practical reality of a divided society. The struggle for self-rule was complicated by these deep-rooted divisions. In some ways, it felt like a tug-of-war between ethnic groups, with each one pulling in a different direction. Lee's PAP pushed for multiracialism, a united Singapore where all ethnic groups would share power. But this wasn't an easy sell, especially when distrust between the Chinese and Malay communities ran so high. The British, seeing the growing instability, tried to buy time with slow reforms, but it was clear that the status quo couldn't hold forever. Meanwhile, the Chinese community, driven by the influence of communist movements, became increasingly militant. The communist threat in Singapore grew, and it posed a challenge not just to British colonial control, but to Lee's vision of a unified multiracial Singapore. At times, it seemed as if Singapore was on the verge of civil conflict. Some critics argue that the British could have done more to manage the tensions, but in reality their ability to control the island was waning. Through it all, Lee Kuan Yew remained a central figure focused on bridging the gaps between communities. He pushed for policies that would foster unity, but his methods were controversial, and not everyone agreed with his approach. Was his focus on multiracialism the key to Singapore's survival, or would it have been easier to pursue a more ethnically driven agenda? Historians still debate the effectiveness of his policies and whether his approach to unity was visionary or naive. As you drift deeper into the story, you can almost feel the weight of those years, the quiet struggles, the hopes and the fears that shaped the future of this tiny island. But what came next was a dramatic turn in Singapore's fate, one that would shift the course of history. By now, you're starting to get a sense of the fire beneath Singapore's calm exterior. But there was still one person who would become the face of the country's rise to prominence, Lee Kuan Yew. Picture him now standing tall in his crisp suit, eyes, sharp hands, steady, never flinching in the face of the storm that was brewing around him. It wasn't just his political acumen that would define him, but his iron will and sense of destiny. Lee wasn't just a politician, he was a visionary, and he had an unshakable belief in Singapore's potential. In the 1950s, Lee's People's Action Party (PAP) began to capture the public imagination, pushing for self-governance and independence. But this was not a smooth road. Lee's rise wasn't just about being a popular figure, it was about taking risks, making enemies, and challenging the status quo. The British were already wary of him. He wasn't the typical colonial subject who would sit quietly under British rule. No, Lee was a man with a plan, and his ambition was as vast as the skyline he would one day build. Historians still argue whether Lee's rise to power was a direct result of his natural charisma and political skill, or whether his leadership was shaped by the political vacuum left by the British. Some believe his rise was a matter of Singapore being ready for a leader who could unite its fractured society, while others suggest that the British were too distracted to stop him. But Lee had a secret weapon, his intellect. He wasn't just a great speaker, he was a master tactician, and he understood that Singapore needed a strategy to navigate its precarious position. He knew that Singapore's survival depended not just on independence, but on its ability to thrive economically. And so as Singapore moved toward full self-governance in the 1960s, Lee's focus was on economic development. It wasn't just about having a strong army or good political relations. Singapore needed a robust economy to stand on its own 2 feet. Lee Kuan Yew's economic vision was one of pragmatism, not ideology. He looked at the world around him, at the new, emerging powers in Asia, and crafted a strategy that was both bold and realistic. He pushed for an industrialized economy focusing on trade, finance, and technology. But there was a catch. Singapore had no natural resources to fall back on. It wasn't like neighboring Malaysia with its rubber plantations or timber. Singapore had to build everything from scratch. At this point, Lee was still navigating the tightrope between the British, his political rivals, and the increasingly powerful communist factions. He understood the stakes he had to succeed, or Singapore would risk slipping into chaos. And yet the path ahead was not without obstacles. Even as Lee led the charge toward independence, he faced internal challenges from both sides, those who wanted a more radical approach to independence and those who feared his authoritarian tendencies. Some argued that Singapore could only survive if it joined forces with Malaysia, which was emerging as an independent nation in 1957. But Lee had other plans. He believed that Singapore needed to be independent not just politically but economically and militarily. His early efforts were focused on securing Singapore's future through trade agreements, building relationships with global powers, and creating a solid economic foundation. Yet the question remained, could Singapore survive alone, separated from the larger Malay Federation? Could it thrive without the backing of the British Empire or a larger regional power? Historians still debate whether Singapore's economic strategy would have worked without Lee's tenacity and his ability to inspire people. Was he simply a man of his time, or did his bold vision shape the future of the island in ways no one could have predicted? As you float deeper into the story, you can almost hear the buzz of Singapore's factories, the hum of a city in the making. The world around Lee was changing, and so was Singapore's destiny. But a new challenge awaited him, one that would take Singapore to the very brink of survival. As the sun set on the 1960s, Singapore found itself standing at a crossroad. Lee Kuan Yew's dream of independence seemed within reach, but there was one major obstacle. Singapore was still a small, vulnerable island in a volatile region. With no natural resources, limited territory, and surrounded by larger, powerful neighbors, Singapore's survival seemed uncertain. But Lee was unshaken. He had a vision, and it didn't include relying on any one power for protection. His plan was to make Singapore indispensable. In 1963, an unexpected turn came, one that would set the stage for one of the most dramatic moments in Singapore's history. Singapore merged with Malaya Sabah and Sarawak to form Malaysia. On paper, this merger was a logical step. After all, Malaysia had more resources, a larger population, and was more strategically positioned. It looked like a promising partnership. But appearances can be deceiving, and what seemed like a match made in heaven quickly turned sour. Historians still argue whether the merger was a doomed venture from the start. Some believe it was always going to fail due to the deep ethnic divisions and conflicting political ideologies, while others suggest that the merger could have worked had both parties been willing to compromise. Singapore, with its predominantly Chinese population, had very different political priorities than Malaya's predominantly Malay population. Singapore's insistence on maintaining its autonomy only added fuel to the fire, and so by 1965 the dream of a united Malaysia began to crumble. Tensions reached a boiling point when racial riots broke out between Malays and Chinese in 1964 with accusations of discrimination and a struggle for political control. The central government in Malaysia grew increasingly frustrated with Singapore's demands for more self-rule, while Singapore's leaders, led by Lee Kuan Yew, felt that their interests were being sidelined. The situation became so dire that Lee Kuan Yew famously declared that Singapore would be forced to leave Malaysia. The separation was sudden and brutal. Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in August 1965, and it was now an independent nation left to face the world on its own. In an emotional speech that would forever mark his leadership, Lee Kuan Yew spoke to his fellow Singaporeans, telling them that despite the pain of separation, it was a necessary step for the survival of the country. In one of the most poignant moments in the history of Singapore, he uttered the words, "We are a small and powerless nation. Our independence is but a moment in history, but we will defend it with everything we have." Historians still debate whether the split between Singapore and Malaysia was a tragic necessity, or whether it could have been avoided. Could the two countries have found a way to coexist peacefully, or was the separation inevitable due to the differing political visions? The fact remains that this was one of the defining moments in Singapore's history, and the decision to part ways would shape the future of both nations for years to come. Now Singapore was truly on its own, a small, newly independent island surrounded by uncertainty and regional instability. Lee Kuan Yew was left to pick up the pieces of a broken dream. Yet against all odds, he was determined to make Singapore thrive. It would not be easy, nothing ever is, but Lee had already shown that he was willing to do whatever it took to secure the future of his people. And so, with Singapore's independence freshly declared, Lee turned his eyes toward the future, focused on what would come next. With Singapore now officially an independent nation, the world watched in curiosity and skepticism. A small island, no natural resources, no hinterland, and surrounded by far larger neighbors, would it even survive, let alone thrive? Lee Kuan Yew, however, was unfazed by the doubters. He was like a man walking on a tightrope, balancing between survival and total collapse with no net below. Every move he made would be scrutinized by the world, but his resolve was unshakable. At the heart of Singapore's struggle for survival was its lack of resources. Unlike many other newly independent nations, Singapore didn't have oil rubber or timber to export. Its land was small, its economy underdeveloped. But Lee Kuan Yew had one thing that many leaders in similar situations didn't: a clear, bold vision. He understood that the future of Singapore wasn't in agriculture or resource extraction, it was in creating a hub for trade finance and industry. Singapore had the right location right in the heart of Southeast Asia, and Lee intended to use it. Historians still debate whether Lee's vision of economic success, his focus on industrialization, attracting foreign investment, and becoming a global financial center, was a stroke of genius, or just a calculated risk. Some believe it was a miracle, while others argue that it was inevitable given Singapore's strategic location and the global forces at play in the 1960s. One of the key moves Lee made was to bring in foreign multinational corporations, MNCs, offering them tax incentives and access to Singapore's port facilities in exchange for investment. It was a gamble, as the idea of relying on foreign companies to help build the nation seemed risky. But it paid off in ways that would lay the groundwork for Singapore's economic miracle. By the early 1970s, Singapore had established itself as a hub for global trade, with MNCs setting up shop, attracted by its strategic location, excellent infrastructure, and business-friendly policies. But it wasn't just foreign capital that Lee Kuan Yew relied on. He also focused on educating Singaporeans, providing a highly skilled workforce to meet the demands of modern industry. The government invested heavily in education and infrastructure, everything from world-class airports to a well-maintained road network, laying the groundwork for long-term growth. Lee knew that in order to survive in an increasingly globalized world, Singapore needed to be more than just a transit point for goods. It had to become a center of innovation, technology, and finance. And so he steered the nation toward rapid industrialization, creating a highly competitive economy based on high-value manufacturing and services. Singapore transformed from a port city into one of the world's busiest financial centers. Its skyline began to change, with gleaming towers rising above the harbor, symbolizing the country's newfound prosperity. However, there were still challenges to face. Internally, Singapore was a divided society with deep racial and religious divisions. Lee Kuan Yew understood that in order for the country to survive and prosper, he had to forge a unified national identity. The solution was multiracialism, a philosophy that promoted equality between the ethnic groups in Singapore. He imposed policies that favored integration, encouraging all communities, Malays, Chinese, Indians, and others, to live, work and study together in an effort to break down the barriers that had long divided them. The critics, however, weren't far behind. Some questioned whether Lee's policies were too harsh, even authoritarian. His strict laws and heavy-handed approach to dissent raised eyebrows both at home and abroad. Was Lee's leadership the key to Singapore's success, or had his methods alienated the very people he sought to unite? Historians still debate whether Singapore's success could have been achieved without Lee's firm hand. Could a more democratic approach have led to the same outcome? Some argue that Lee's tactics were necessary for the survival of Singapore, while others believe that his authoritarian approach might have stunted the country's social development. But regardless of the debate, one fact remains clear: Singapore's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. By the mid-1970s, Singapore had already begun to demonstrate the fruits of its hard-fought independence. The skyline had changed, no longer a collection of colonial-era buildings and modest homes, but an ambitious city towering with gleaming glass structures that seemed to reach for the heavens. Yet despite this remarkable economic transformation, Lee Kuan Yew knew that survival wasn't guaranteed. Singapore was still a tiny island surrounded by large, often unstable neighbors. With no natural resources, no deep hinterland to fall back on, the country's future could change in the blink of an eye. As Singapore's economy boomed, however, it became clear that Lee's strategy of attracting foreign investment combined with a strong centralized government was working. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Singapore had cemented itself as one of the world's busiest ports and financial centers, pulling in capital, businesses and talent from all corners of the globe. But Lee, ever pragmatic, knew that economic prosperity alone wouldn't ensure long-term survival. Singapore had to become indispensable, and to do so it would need a reputation not only for its economic prowess, but also for its strategic importance. Lee had his eyes set on the bigger picture. He wanted to solidify Singapore's place on the international stage, and in doing so secure its future. This meant forming strong diplomatic ties with global powers like the United States, Japan, and China. Lee understood that in an increasingly interconnected world, Singapore's size and location could either work against it or work for it. But how could a small island nation make itself a crucial player in world politics? The answer lay in becoming a hub of diplomacy and trade, an essential link in the global chain. Historians still debate the extent to which Lee's diplomatic efforts were a deliberate strategy or the result of fortuitous timing. Was it Singapore's geographical location that made it so valuable, or was it Lee's cunning ability to forge connections with the right powers at the right time? Either way, Singapore's diplomatic acumen became one of its most valuable assets. Lee forged relationships with regional powers like Indonesia and Malaysia, but he also reached out to global giants, positioning Singapore as a neutral ground for talks and trade. By the 1990s, Singapore's global presence had solidified. The city-state wasn't just a regional leader, it had become an influential force on the world stage. Lee's vision had taken root, and Singapore now sat comfortably among the most prosperous and stable nations in the world. But even as his vision materialized into the gleaming metropolis you might imagine today, Lee remained as focused as ever. The global stage was shifting, and he knew that Singapore had to evolve constantly to stay ahead of the curve. But Singapore's success wasn't just about its economy or diplomacy. It was also about its internal unity, something that had always been at the heart of Lee Kuan Yew's philosophy. The idea of multiracialism, the belief that Singaporeans of all ethnicities could live together harmoniously, was not just a policy, it was a way of life. Under Lee's government, policies were implemented to ensure that no one group dominated over the others, with laws and initiatives designed to promote equal opportunities for all ethnicities. This vision of unity, however, was not without its critics. Some argued that Lee's strict control over Singapore's multicultural policies bordered on authoritarianism, particularly when it came to issues like housing and education. Was Lee too heavy-handed in his approach to racial integration? Did his methods of ensuring harmony leave room for the individuality of the country's different communities? Historians still debate these questions, whether the balance Lee struck between unity and freedom was the right one, or whether it stifled the creative spirit of Singapore's citizens. Regardless, one thing remained certain: Lee Kuan Yew's leadership was central to Singapore's meteoric rise. Under his guidance, Singapore had been transformed from a small, impoverished city-state into a global economic powerhouse, and his legacy would shape the island nation for generations to come. But even in the midst of success, Lee Kuan Yew was always looking ahead, constantly calculating, adapting, and preparing Singapore for whatever challenges the future might hold. As you settle deeper into the rhythm of the story, it's clear that Singapore's journey was anything but easy. But against the odds, Lee's unwavering determination and his vision for a united, prosperous nation had turned the once struggling city-state into a shining example of what could be achieved with the right leadership and a sense of destiny. As Singapore entered the 21st century, it had already outgrown the doubts of the past. Once a fledgling city-state unsure of its place in the world, it had become a beacon of success, a thriving modern city with one of the highest standards of living in the world. Lee Kuan Yew's vision had materialized, but the question remained: what would happen after his time? The transition of leadership was inevitable. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Lee Kuan Yew had groomed his successor, his deputy Goh Chok Tong, whom he believed could carry on the Singaporean dream. Lee Kuan Yew was still the guiding force behind the nation, but he was also preparing Singapore for the inevitable day when he would step down. In 1990, Goh Chok Tong became Prime Minister, with Lee Kuan Yew assuming a role as Senior Minister. This transition marked a significant moment in Singapore's political evolution. As Singapore moved into the 21st century, it faced new challenges that required adaptability. While Lee's authoritarian style had been critical in Singapore's early years, the global landscape had changed. Globalization, the rise of technology, and new economic powers had shifted the dynamics of international competition. For the first time, Singapore had to confront the reality that it could no longer rely on Lee's leadership to navigate every storm. But Lee had done something remarkable. He had created a nation that was capable of evolving, capable of holding its own in a fast-changing world. Historians still debate how much of Singapore's success was built on Lee's leadership alone, and how much of it was due to the foundations he laid, institutions, policies, and a sense of national pride that allowed the country to continue thriving long after he left office. Was it Lee's unyielding governance that made Singapore a success? Or was it the resilient people who embraced the vision he had crafted for them? But one thing became abundantly clear: even after Lee Kuan Yew stepped back from daily politics, his shadow loomed large over the country. Singapore's continued success in the 21st century is as much about Lee's legacy as it is about the collective will of its people. The country shaped by his vision had built the momentum to keep pushing forward, continuing to evolve with the times. In the years that followed, Singapore continued its trajectory of prosperity. The economy remained strong, even as the global economy fluctuated. Singapore had transformed itself into an international hub for finance, trade, and innovation, with some of the world's most advanced technology companies establishing themselves in the city. Yet despite its glittering success, the country continued to grapple with issues that would challenge even the most prosperous nations: inequality, housing affordability, and the pressures of an aging population. Lee Kuan Yew's successors, including Goh Chok Tong and later Lee Hsien Loong, Lee's eldest son, inherited the responsibility of ensuring Singapore's place in the world. Yet even with a smooth transition of leadership, the legacy of Lee's leadership still played a defining role in shaping policies and national priorities. The question of whether Singapore's future could be as bright as its past loomed large, but it was also clear that the resilience Lee Kuan Yew had instilled in his people would continue to guide them through uncertainty. Historians argue whether Lee's leadership style and policies were a one-off success story, something that only worked in the specific context of Singapore, or whether his model could be replicated elsewhere. Was it the strength of his character and vision that allowed him to push Singapore forward, or was it the times with their demands for stability and growth that made Lee's methods so effective? As Lee Kuan Yew's legacy continues to evolve, the answer remains elusive. Singapore's rise from a tiny trading port to a global powerhouse was not the result of luck. It was the product of leadership vision and a deep commitment to national survival. And as the world continues to change, Singapore's ability to adapt, innovate, and maintain its position at the forefront of global affairs is a testament to the resilience of Lee Kuan Yew's leadership and the enduring spirit of the country he built. As the 21st century progressed, Singapore's achievements were undeniable. The city-state had established itself not only as an economic powerhouse, but also as a model of governance in the modern era. Its resilience in the face of global shifts, economic crises, and regional instability spoke to the power of a vision that had been planted decades ago by Lee Kuan Yew. Yet even as Singapore thrived, the nation found itself confronting a new set of challenges that would force it to redefine its role in the world. The world around Singapore had dramatically changed since the days of Lee's leadership. While the city-state had once been surrounded by uncertainty, it was now nestled in a rapidly changing global order. The rise of China as an economic and political superpower, the shifting dynamics of global trade, and the growing complexities of international diplomacy presented new tests for Singapore. How could this tiny island nation maintain its relevance and influence when faced with such colossal global shifts? Lee Kuan Yew had understood the importance of global relationships, but now his successors had to navigate a multipolar world where power was distributed among many rather than concentrated in one or two dominant forces. This required diplomacy and adaptability on a scale even Lee might not have anticipated. Singapore's success had always been built on its ability to maintain neutrality, to act as a bridge between East and West, and to leverage its geographical position for strategic advantage. But in an era of shifting allegiances and economic fragmentation, could this small island continue to thrive in the same way? One of the defining features of Singapore's success under Lee was its constant reinvention. As the global economy shifted, so too did Singapore's approach. No longer was it simply a financial hub or an industrial powerhouse. It had become a leader in technology research and sustainable development. Singapore was investing in green technologies, in smart cities, and in artificial intelligence, positioning itself as a forward-thinking nation that could adapt to the next big change before it arrived. But even as Singapore advanced in the fields of technology and innovation, it continued to face internal challenges. The question of social equality remained a hot topic, with some arguing that the economic success of the country had not fully translated into equitable opportunities for all its citizens. The disparity between the wealthy elite and the lower income classes, particularly among the migrant worker community, continued to be a source of social tension. Lee Kuan Yew's vision of a harmonious multiracial society had succeeded in many ways, but it wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would require more than just economic growth. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of Lee Kuan Yew's policies. Were they ultimately sustainable, or had they built a system too reliant on centralized control and top-down governance? Some argue that Lee's strict methods ensured stability, but others suggest that this stability might have come at the cost of personal freedoms and democratic processes. Could Singapore's continued success be tied to its commitment to maintaining control, or would the future demand more flexibility and openness? In the end, Singapore's journey wasn't just about economic growth or political survival, it was about navigating the complexities of identity governance and global relations. It was about shaping a future that stayed true to its roots while adapting to the challenges of an ever-changing world. The legacy of Lee Kuan Yew lived on in every corner of the island, from the gleaming towers that stretched toward the sky to the smart streets and green spaces that reflected the nation's commitment to progress. But it was also in the spirit of resilience that continued to define Singapore: resilience in the face of adversity, resilience in the face of change, and most of all, resilience in the face of those who once said it couldn't be done. And so as you drift deeper into the night, know that Singapore's journey is not just a story of a city-state, it's a story of survival, adaptation, and the unyielding determination of a nation to forge its own path. As the city sleeps below, the quiet hum of its continued growth echoes in the hearts of those who built it. Now, as Singapore continues to chart its course in the 21st century, its history stands as both a testament and a challenge. The challenges of the past, from colonial rule to ethnic strife and the dramatic expulsion from Malaysia, have all shaped the character of the nation. But as the world looks to the future, the question arises, what will the next chapter in Singapore's story look like? Will it continue to follow Lee Kuan Yew's path of controlled governance, or will it evolve into something even more open and democratic? These are questions that are being asked not just by historians, but by the citizens of Singapore themselves. As the global stage shifts, Singapore is no longer just trying to survive, it's striving to maintain its place in a rapidly evolving world. In the past, its strength was built on its ability to adapt, to find niches in the global economy and make itself indispensable. But the world is changing faster than ever, and Singapore's future may require a different kind of adaptation, a shift from being a small, tightly controlled city-state to a more open, inclusive society that embraces even more diverse voices and challenges. One of the most profound tests for Singapore is balancing its reputation for stability with the growing desire for greater political freedom among its people. As the younger generation rises to prominence, they demand more transparency, more representation, and more space for dialogue. The older generations, shaped by Lee Kuan Yew's approach, often worry about what might be lost in the pursuit of these ideals. Is there a way to balance the need for progress with the nation's need for stability? Can Singapore find a new path, one that honors its past while embracing the future? Historians still debate how Singapore's model of governance will evolve. Some argue that Lee's authoritarian style set the nation on a path that is difficult to stray from. Others believe that the future will require more openness, more dialogue, and more cooperation with the global community. The question remains, can Singapore maintain its prosperity and relevance without sacrificing its core values? As we reach the end of Singapore's journey through history, the island remains a place of endless possibilities. Its rise from colonial port to global economic power has already become the stuff of legend. But what is perhaps most remarkable about Singapore's story is that it hasn't reached its end. It continues to evolve, shaped by the same forces of ambition, resilience, and adaptability that guided it from the very beginning. As you let the night settle around, you know that Singapore's story is not just one of a city or even a country, but of a people determined, forward-looking, and never satisfied with the status quo. The future of Singapore is unwritten, but one thing is certain: the island will keep moving forward, adapting, overcoming, and thriving, just as it always has. And perhaps this story will continue to unfold, not just in history books, but in the lives of the people who walk its streets and build its future.